Welcome back to Rise to Liberty podcast. Today I am joined by Joseph Solis-Mullen, correct?
Yes.
All right. I'm glad I nailed that pronunciation. Just real quick before we get going into this, I do want to drop our sponsor, which is Nadu Shave Co. Absolutely the best razors money can buy. Don't fall into this big shave conspiracy of selling you multi-blade Chinese made plastic crap. It is absolutely doing, absolute damage to your skin. And actually purchase from a company that actually cares about their customers. It is a veteran owned, family operated business right here in the US. I use this personally. I actually forgot to use it today, so I'm going to have to go do that after the show. But they have the balls to sponsor this show. So, they must be good. So go to nadeaushaveco.com, nadeaushave.com. Use promo code RISE15 at checkout for 15% off your order. Nadeu Shave Co., where tradition beats modernity. All right, let's get into this. So, Joseph Solis-Mullen is the author of The Fake China Threat, an absolutely wonderful book that I highly recommend all of you pick up. So I guess just getting straight into it. Okay, why do people believe that China is a threat?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I suppose over the years talking about this, I've been talking about this for several years now. The book came out last year, but I had been writing a series of articles and had started to become sort of well known in our circles for my sort of heterodox opinion about this topic. And I've started talking about this by prefacing with, what do you imagine a threat looks like? Is it, for example, the threat is the United States Navy not being able to sail to and fro right off of China's shores, doing whatever? If Washington being able to do whatever it wants, wherever it wants, regardless of what Chinese politicians, military leaders might think, if you consider that a threat, then okay, all right, China's a threat now. China cannot be bought or bullied. That was always the case. They were, very reluctant to do anything that they didn't want to. The partnership between the United States and China was really a product of the need to balance against the Soviet Union on both of their parts. And even then, thorny issues like Taiwan just had to kind of be hedged around, worked around. If you read the language of the three communiques, it was very, very difficult. And this was when China was at a position of tremendous relative weakness compared to the United States. If you look at China today, world's second largest economy, they've invested a lot of money in their military. They have a tremendous standoff capability, meaning that they have invested not in the capability of full spectrum domination. That's why we have $1 trillion military budget here in the United States. Is Washington wants the ability to project power all over the globe at the drop of a hat. That is not the capability that China and its leaders have invested in. Instead, they have developed a doctrine of area denial. They have lots of missile batteries, anti-ship capabilities right off their shores. And the goal here is to be able to keep the United States Navy away from them in the event of a conflict, which, if you were Chinese, would seem a very sensible thing to do. And so I always start with that position of, look, what is a threat? What is China going to invade the United States? No, not a chance. Do they want to invade the United States? No, not a chance. Would they like to see the United States start respecting their prerogatives right in their own backyard? In, for example, the South China Sea? Probably. And so as this conversation develops, I'm talking about the national discussion surrounding China. I think we first need to clarify, what does it mean for China to be a threat? It's just taken for granted that, yes, China's a threat. What do we mean? What do we mean by this? So that's where I would start with that. It seems, China's big, it's scary. There's that sort of Cold War hangover there. The regime is often referred to as just the communists, right? The Communist Party of China. So I think it just plays naturally to a certain demographic. Certainly my dad gets triggered. Just my dad is 75 years old Vietnam guy. You know, I come from a family of pure neocons. I mean, they hear communist and they go crazy. So for a certain segment of the population, a very powerful donor base and voting population, that gray vote really gets out there. It's automatic for them. They grew up on this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not hard to sell them that those evil communists are out to do it again. You saw the bridge, the terrible thing with the bridge that happened, right?
Yeah.
I kid you not. The first thing that occurred to me was like, I'll bet there's people that are going to start blaming China. And of course, that was the first thing that happened. It was the Chinese did it. Somehow the Chinese remote controlled the boat into the bridge to do it to us. And I, went over to see my dad afterwards, and he goes, "Yeah, did you hear that the Chinese did it?" I said, "Dad, come on, don't you demand any amount of evidence? Like after everything we've been through, don't you want to see the evidence?" It's like TikTok. I don't know. I know that they have shown us no evidence that the Chinese government is behind this, that the Chinese government is doing this, that it's some sort of, top-down directed psyop. It could be, but they've shown no evidence. And yet they want to pass broad-reaching national security, state-expanding, Constitution, Bill of Rights destroying bills on the basis of supposition.
Yeah.
Innuendo. Hints. I'd like to see evidence, frankly.
Yeah.
So
it does kind of just seem like it's more of a hysteria tactic that's left over from the Cold War that was once used from the Russians, which I guess the left is still trying to milk that cow. But then now the right has their own Russia, which is China. And it does, at this point, definitely seems like hysteria, at least to me, and I assume others, especially if you're watching this stream. But so is that what you would say? Is there no threat from China? Would that be a would that be a statement that would be comfortable for you to agree with? Is that there's no threat?
Again, I mean, it depends on what you mean. Like if you mean that China is going to try and, all the things that China is blamed for are not China's fault. The opioid epidemic, that wasn't China that created an opioid epidemic. It's not quote unquote China that's selling all of these precursor chemicals, right? This is a response to the failed policy of the war on drugs. This is just what happens. Tons of these precursor chemicals are coming. The majority of them are actually coming from India, but you'll never ever hear that reported. Why? Because what Washington and what the corporate media would like is they would like India to help them contain China. And so the narrative can't be that it's India that's doing these things because they've spent years telling you that it's the Chinese doing it and it's so malicious. Well, wait a minute. The Indians are doing it. These chemicals are coming in through Canada, right? But again, we want to keep the Canadians on side so we don't make it about the Canadians. If the United States were to try to help encourage an official declaration of independence from Taiwan or something like that, which there are people on the Hill who would love to do that. We've seen very aggressive moves. I mean, there are literally U.S. soldiers now stationed on these little spits of rock within sight of mainland China now. What interest of the average American does that serve? And it serves none. It serves zero interest. What it is, and this is where I think having a comprehensive way of thinking about foreign policy helps. It's who do these policies serve? Why? It's not a strategic. There's no strategic reason for having these guys here. In the event of a conflict, these Billy Badasses, the baddest ass guys that the U.S. has to offer, special forces guys, they'd be killed immediately. They're completely exposed within throwing distance of the Chinese shore. They'd be killed immediately. That's not why they're there. They're there to serve as a meat shield, a tripwire, a provocation, some other reason than to keep us here safe, because they're not here keeping us safe, which is ostensibly the reason the U.S. military exists, right?
Right.
So we have to ask, why are these policies? Well, I can tell you this. For the Taiwanese to actually be able to defend themselves from a possible mainland Chinese invasion, it's not possible. They couldn't spend enough money. They don't have the resources. But by spending $25 million a year on lobbying in Washington, they can get us to carry the water for them. It's just that simple. It's the same reason the Israelis do it. They take a little bit of that $5 billion that they get given every year, and they just funnel it back in the form of lobbying. And it's perfectly legal as long as you fill out the paperwork. We would call it bribery, obviously, but as long as you fill out the proper paperwork, it's just called lobbying. And every once in a while, there will be a little scandal because someone forgot to renew their form or something like that to register as a foreign agent. But these are Americans. You see them on the nightly news, and there's no report of a conflict of interest where they're getting their money from. It's really incredible. And you see a lot of governments doing it. A lot of governments have realized, foreign governments have realized that the easiest way to get what they want from Washington is to pour some money, a couple $1 million, which to us, $1 million. To the Saudis, that's nothing. That's not even an accounting error. That's not even a rounding error. It's nothing, but it can get them a lot for that money. And so we are basically being had. I mean, there's no other way around saying it. And for a long time, these policies have had a very low cost. Because they've been used to facilitate the bombing of defenseless brown people in the Middle East. Trying to do those sorts of things had no real immediate danger. Like, yes, there was blowback terrorism and stuff, but there's nothing like what could happen that's now being talked about regularly in the corporate press. Like, we're just gonna like they're just gonna fight the Chinese. Like, there's just gonna be a big air-sea battle, and we're just gonna fight them. And it's just like World War II. And don't worry about nuclear weapons. No one will do that. Just relax, everyone. Yeah. And I just feel like as Americans, like, we should demand accountability. Why are these policies being pursued? How concretely do they serve us? Forget all the scare tactics. Let's have some facts. And that's why I wrote the book. And that's why I kept it super short, is I want people to read it, to just start thinking. I'm not telling you in the book how to think. I am telling you clearly what my perspective is. And I'm telling you why I think these things. I hate you with all facts. The book is full of footnotes. Comprehensive bibliography at the end for you to go look for yourself. The book is about getting you to ask questions. Why are these policies? Why is China, after 30 years of engagement, being framed as this tremendous existential threat to America, Americans, and our way of life? That everything bad that happens, somehow there's a perfidious Chinese influence behind it.
Yeah, it seems like not that long ago, it was quite an amazing feat to open up trade with China. Just not that long ago. Well, maybe that long ago to some of us, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't seem that long ago on the big scale of the timeline. So, and it seems as though, at least from my memory, and you're a little bit older than I am, but it just seems like China has been made, at least the enemy that it's portrayed as today, within the last 10, 15 years. Does that sound about right?
Very accurate. Very accurate.
So my question, why do you think specifically the right has gleamed onto this idea of this existential threat that's going to bring down our American way of life? Ooh, look, big, scary red flag.
Well, I'll say this. This in part goes all the way back to the 1940s and 1950s, when the Republicans were lost out in the wilderness. They had no clear way back to power. And so they grabbed on to anti-communism. That became their way back into relevance, because all they could say otherwise, except for those few voices in the wilderness, the old right, Murray Rothbard called them, the new right, all they could say was, well, we'll manage this socialism better than the Democrats will, which isn't a great pitch, right? It's not that's not the greatest pitch in the world. No, instead you frame them as in the pocket of the communists who are bent on taking over the world. and you concoct this ludicrous story, and you stage all these hearings and things. How things don't change, right? Light on, yeah, just totally contrived. Yeah, so that it is what it is. This plays. There's a reason that they keep going back to it. There's always a new enemy. It keeps everyone paid. It's a good glue. It keeps the state whole and healthy, right? Because if there wasn't something they needed to defend us from, what would their reason for being be? They wouldn't have one. And so, yes, there were always some within the Republican Eastern establishment who took over the party in the 50s and 60s. There were always some who did not like Nixon's opening to China. It's why he did it the way he did it. And this is where Trump, I've never voted for him. I think he's kind of an idiot, whatever. He said some smart things on the campaign trail. People who think that he's some sort of like libertarian godsend are totally delusional. Did not pay attention to his first term in office at all. Whatever. Point being, Trump, comes in saying, he's on the campaign trail saying, Russia, we need to make friends with Russia and stuff, totally telegraphing his moves, allowing the national security state to undermine him, to frame him, to box him in. Nixon said nothing to anyone. He kept it between him and Kissinger because he said later that he knew he couldn't trust the State Department to carry out what he wanted them to do, which was an opening to China. This is why, for example, the U.S. turned the blind eye when the Pakistanis started pursuing nuclear weapons, is because the Pakistanis helped facilitate this opening. It was through Pakistan that Kissinger got to China. Anyway, so it was controversial. And Nixon gets chased out of office before he's able to finish this program. And there are a lot of things that happened in the 1970s. The 1970s are a very pivotal decade in terms of understanding why the American economy started to change the way that it did, moving toward financialization rather than industrial manufacturing. I really can't go too into the weeds on that. I do have an article on the Libertarian Institute website, trading the Rust Belt for military bases. It was basically about asymmetrical trade concessions in order to gain security prerogative dominance. This is one of the reasons that I think, like you said, about 15 years ago, Washington's mentality towards China began to subtly change. And it's because they realized that China was never going to be the pliant security partner that they were used to dealing with. It's one of the reasons that they were never able to really get along with Russia, even when it was Boris Yeltsin in charge, even before Vladimir Putin was there. So there were always some, especially on the right. I can remember going back and doing research, finding Newt Gingrich giving completely ridiculous speeches in the 1990s about how we need to defend Taiwan and, Taiwanese liberty against, the dangerous Chinese communists and stuff like that. So there was always this segment of the right who held on for dear life to this China threat narrative, and is largely because they're communists. Which, I mean, again, like Venezuela is another good example. Like, why does it matter to the United States, to U.S. security, that Venezuela has a socialist government?
Yeah.
All it has done, all that the United States actions have done. Sorry to just jump the track here for just a second, but just the migrant crisis, right? Like, Venezuela is a huge country with tons of people, and you're basically helping because, of course, the socialists can make it miserable all on their own. But combined with the drug war and these economic and political pressures, you're combining to make a migrant crisis where there wouldn't even be one. And this goes all the way back to the 80s and the interventions in Central America, and all the way back to Nixon and the failed policy of the war on drugs, which has led to the militarization of these cartels to the point where if you sent the Marines in to northern Mexico, I mean, we would be getting lots of body bags back. Like, obviously, the U.S. military would kill them, but like, it would be bad. It would be bad. I mean, these guys are armed to the teeth.
They'd definitely put up a fight.
Yeah. I mean, they're rolling around in like military level stuff, armored vehicles, etc. So, I mean, this is what these interventionist policies do. But the fact that they don't work is irrelevant, because that's not why they exist. They exist to keep existing interests entrenched, right? Yeah. No one at the DEA is saying, gosh, you guys, this war on drugs, there's still the same amount of people on drugs and using drugs that there were 40, 50 years ago. And we're gobbling up all this money. Maybe it would be better for the American people if we changed tact, cut all our jobs and stuff. No one thinks like that. No one talks like that. And it's unrealistic as Americans to think that some bureaucrat somewhere is thinking that way. Right? It's a republic if you can keep it. It is the job of the citizenry to evaluate, to ask these critical questions, not to take the government's word for it. I mean, I sometimes wonder, if I brought back Thomas Jefferson or something, like what would he say about like what's going on? And apart from lamenting that Canada was like a thing and not part of the United States, I feel like the thing that would really blow his mind is that people just like look at like say, well, the government said didn't you hear what they said?
Yeah.
Didn't you hear what the spokesman for the government said? It's
Yeah.
wild. It's totally wild.
Well,
I don't know. And the left has totally thrown in the towel. The left, give us back the good George W. Bush days where they said, oh, this war is stupid and obviously for oil for Israel. Now they're like, aren't you going to listen to the government while we bomb these people? Like,
yeah.
Such a joke. Such a joke.
It's interesting to me because this is a narrative that typically comes from the right. I've heard a few one-off lefties kind of bring up China, but the right, who at least right now kind of is like priding themselves on being the free thinking people, the people that are wise to a lot of the propaganda and things like this, but they're still falling for this, like hook, line, and sinker. Like, I think I've sent you a couple of screenshots or a couple of posts that have come across my timeline of just that very thing of, some of these free thinking Republicans, or I'm not even sure what to call them, just the right, that, like I said, just pride themselves on being so wise to the propaganda, yet they're falling for the propaganda that's still being pushed by Fox News. And it's amazing to me. So,
well, and part of that is just lack of information. Scott, says, if you know nothing, you'll fall for anything. And that is part of what we have going on here. I mean, half the people telling you we should fight for Taiwan will point to Hainan Island when you ask them to point to Taiwan on a map. Like, they don't know. They don't understand. They don't know anything about China's economy, how it works. They don't really know anything about the history of Sino-American relations. History started a few weeks ago or this morning.
Yeah.
And whatever the TV just said or whatever I read on social media, and I'm sure we'll talk about TikTok at some point, but American social media companies, like there is a reason that TikTok is being targeted and not them.
Yeah.
Right? Like there is a filtration process. It is not total suppression. I mean, sometimes there is flat out, like they'll take content down, but it's more about massaging and managing what people are seeing and how they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
One book that I always recommend to my students, my incoming students in the political science department, is The Manufacture of Consent. They should really make like an update. Should really make an updated version of it, because I find myself having to explain, because a lot of the examples come from like the 1980s and the Reagan and early Bush administration, but it's the same. It is the same. They need to massage and manage the narrative, and these social media companies, these American social media companies, play ball with the U.S. government. I mean, they have whole compliance departments. It's literally someone's full-time job is giving the government whatever they ask for. Now, they can, in theory, tell the government no, but that's a big pain, and you don't even know that it's going on anyway. It's all secret. So it's not like you're going to object. You don't even know what's going on. And it's just easier for them to just do what the government asks, so that the government doesn't, pursue them with fines or regulatory action or things of that nature. It's a very it's a very nice, tight relationship there. There's a nice revolving door too between the tech industry and high government and these universities out west. Like Stanford University has just become a cesspool. It was always bad, but now it's just horrible. I think there might be something in the water. I don't know. But it's really bad. And of course, TikTok doesn't play that way. TikTok is a Singaporean company. They don't share data with the United States government. They don't massage the narrative so that people don't have to see tons of pro-Palestinian content, right? This is why Fox News is telling people that TikTok is turning people against Israel. It's because
Yeah.
TikTok isn't the algorithm isn't manipulatively suppressing that kind of content. Like the overwhelming majority of the world, just look at the world, look at internet traffic,
Yeah.
and look at where people's countries are voting on these resolutions. Like it's pretty much the United States and Israel against everyone else.
Yeah.
So like it's not it's the other companies that are manipulating what you're seeing. Again, it's not that you can't find it. It's just what's going to come up naturally, or quote unquote naturally. So that's one of the reasons TikTok has to go.
So in my state, the state government here made news not too long ago as being one of the first states to sue TikTok, for the safety of the children. The Maud Flanders, won't somebody please think of the children, And while this is going on, Utah has a NSA facility collecting all of our data. And it's proudly state sponsored. The county government there sells water for the water cooled computers, like 10 cents on the gallon, where even the local farmers have to pay $1.50 a gallon. And there are people over here just calling for all of this growth of state under the guise of protecting the children. Let's ban TikTok. Let's put on ID verification on the internet. All of these other things, while at the same time supporting the NSA facility right in our backyard. And
it reminds me of that old onion bit where they're talking about super spy Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook as a creation of the CIA, and how it was the greatest tool ever because now the CIA doesn't have to guess where you are. They check your Facebook and they tell you right where you're going to be, and they can pick you out. He goes, yeah, that's how they got my brother.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. Like we went from this norm of private life. You have a private life. It, unlisted fund. You had this. It would have been 20, 30 years ago for someone to like purposely publish all their information of what they're doing all the time. They would have been considered sick. They would have sent them to see a therapist or something. And now it's become the norm. And your digital footprint, I mean, there's everything you do is being tracked. Everything you do is being tracked. And of course, what will they say? Well, the defenders of the state, they'll say, well, if you're not doing anything, what do you have to worry about? What do you care if the American government's spying on you, huh?
Yeah.
You got something to hide? It's like, that's not what the Constitution says. That's not what the Bill of Rights says. Do you guys understand limited government? And no, of course they don't. They don't. It is hardly any surprise that the 20th century, the century of central banking and total war, went hand in hand with the expansion of the state. Yeah. And rolling this back is a monumental task, but it starts with saying no to militarism. The old Randolph Bourne quote, war is the health of the state. Right? Before that, even war made the state. And then in a self-recursive, regenerative process, the state made more war. That is just the logic of states. It is the logic of competition in that way. And internally, if you're going to constantly be waging warfare, you need more resources. You need more discipline internally. You need less dissent. Like these are all antithetical to freedom. Go read the Federalist Papers and things of that nature. I mean, I know your listeners are very familiar, of all things to be feared, it is a standing army. Standing armies are the known instruments of despotism. For with them come war and taxes, right? This was obvious to inheritors of the English Whig tradition, which is what we inherited and then wasted away. There's a great essay by William Graham Sumner called The Conquest of the United States by Spain. It's a really, really great essay. You can find it online where he talks about the United States is poised. It's 1898. The United States is poised to leap out into the world and start grabbing overseas colonies and stuff. They've just finished absorbing the rest of the western frontier there. And they're going to fight a war with Spain to take all of these Spanish colonies and start building an overseas empire. And he warns in the essay that if we do this, we're going to become just like these European empires, just like these totally encompassing states that have no truck with violating the rights of their citizens in the name of pursuing imperial ambitions. And it was a totally prescient essay. Totally prescient essay. You read it today and you're like, yep, yeah, that happened.
I love
Yep,
those.
that's happening now.
I love those.
Very timeless and timely for that reason.
So one question I'm sure I'll get after this. If I don't ask this question, I'm sure I'll get, like, why didn't you? So say you were in an elevator and had to give the elevator pitch to some important diplomat or bureaucrat. What are the reasons that it is ridiculous to look at China as a threat? Like, what are the reasons that you could point to, whether it be economical or militarily? What are the reasons China's not a threat?
I would say demographically, they're the fastest growing population on Earth. In 20 years, they're going to look like Japan. Number two, they're completely encircled by powers who do not want necessarily to have a problem with China, but they have no interest in being swallowed up into a Chinese sphere of influence. I'm talking about India, the Philippines, Japan, Indonesia. And these countries, especially the Philippines and Indonesia, these are some of the fastest growing populations on Earth. They have hundreds of millions of people here. India is already more populous than China. These countries can handle any kind of potential Chinese expansionism on their own, which is not what the Chinese government is looking to do anyway. Everything that we see from them is concerned with protecting what's theirs, protecting their core national interest. The Chinese Communist Party understands that war is a hazardous venture. They haven't fought a war since 1979. They are not raging militarist expansionists. They haven't started any wars since 1979. They understand it can be very destabilizing. Their country is going through a very, very difficult transition period right now. It's still got a lot of growing to do. The country is still very poor in many respects, and there's a very high youth employment rate right now. And they do not want to risk any kind of destabilization of the situation there. The Chinese want nothing more than for the status quo to stay in place, and that is exactly what we should be seeking too. It has worked just fine for 50 years. There's no reason to mess with it.
Absolutely perfect. Now, one thing I do want to touch on, admittedly, I don't know as much about this as I should. I've definitely just blown it off, which is not as, not probably the smartest thing, which is also why I don't talk a whole lot about it. But what is the deal with the fear over the Chinese purchasing land here in the States? Is this happening? Is this actually something that should be a concern? What is the big deal with the Chinese purchasing land?
And again, I always like to, because I get this question a lot because it's in the news, right? It's not China purchasing land. It's individuals in China and corporations in China purchasing land. They own less than 1% of U.S. farmland. So number one, they own less than 1%. So that personally doesn't seem very scary to me. There are lots of other countries that lack lots of good arable land, like Saudi Arabia, for example, who also own farmland and farm, for example, alfalfa over here. It's actually something out west, out in Arizona, very unpopular actually, because it uses a lot of water.
Yeah.
Now that's another question though. Is land freely alienable, right? Is that your private property? Can you sell it to whoever you want? Where in the Constitution does it say that the government has the right to look at all your purchases and all your sales and say yes, no, right? That to me is very highly suspect. It's true. But I think it's also important to look at China's situation. Number one, these Chinese corporations who are buying land, China's own land situation is a little rough. China's internal geography is a little sketchy. There's a lot of desert, there's a lot of mountain, there's a lot of jungle. They still have 1 billion people, and in terms of arable land per capita, they're not actually very strong. Like, they do have a couple of good breadbasket areas, but it also requires a lot of application of petrochemicals. There's also a lot of environmental degradation that's happened. So in one sense, having alternative sources of land is smart for these corporations. It's also been one of the best investment vehicles over the last 40 years. And the Chinese, for all the propaganda about, oh, what a bunch of commies, they're totally state capitalists. They understand, they have a stock market. They understand rates of return versus capital investment. And U.S. farmland has been an incredible thing to own over the last 40 years. So that's what I would say about that. Yes, they own less than 1%. It's true that various Chinese individuals and entities own some of this farmland. They're using it for various purposes. And that's really it. They're not the only foreign government to be doing this.
So when it always is interesting to me, just because the news would have you believe, I mean, they're right up there with Bill Gates being like, the third largest owner of all land in the United States, and they're buying it right next to military bases. And like I even saw something about that today, that all the land they're purchasing is all secret, and it just seems like a headache. But I think this kind of lends to an issue that isn't talked about, although you did mention it in your book, is that they simply don't have the food to be able to wage a war.
Oh, the Chinese are very globalization dependent. Yes, that's I don't remember which chapter that's in, but yes, well, the book is short, so anyone looking to read the book, it's like 80-90 pages. I kept this very tight, very short. I really want you to read it, and I know that long form reading is dying out. If you hand someone a few hundred-page book, they're not going to read it. They're just not. There's so many competing demands on their time. There are so many different media for them to consume. I'm working on a couple of other books now, and the biggest problem that I have is cutting. This original book was close to 200 pages, and it was cutting. So sorry, I lost my train of thought here. It's late here. Sorry, it's almost 9 o'clock. Food. Oh, yes, globalization dependency. Yes, China does not have the kinds of oil and natural gas capacity right now, or the food capacity. Like, it is highly globalization dependent right now. The last thing that, and it's totally export dependent too. Like, if its exports stop, its economy collapses. If the imports stop coming, the economy collapses. The United States is in this very incredible position where we don't really think about this very much. We kind of take it for granted that we can feed ourselves, we can satisfy our own energy needs, and that's all true. That's all true. That is not true of China. China has been the biggest winner, relatively speaking. We've all been winners. We've all, in aggregate, been winners from globalization. Obviously, some communities, individual communities and individuals have suffered. For example, in the Rust Belt, like, I live in Michigan, so I am aware of like, driving through that area there, like Youngstown, Ohio, and things of that nature. However, generally speaking, we've all benefited from that. China has relatively benefited the most. India, probably like a distant second or third. But China has been able to grow its economy, feed its enormous population. It still has a long way to go, though. That's what I point out to people. Like, just look at their per capita meat consumption and electricity usage, and even things like their GDP per capita. I mean, they're still just very, very poor compared to us. Like, the interior of China is still, Tennessee Valley Authority level poor, right? So there's a lot of work to do there, and the Chinese would like to keep globalization in place. And I guess maybe this would be a good place to jump back to 10-15 years ago, like you talked about, where the narrative started to change. Now, I will point out that Donald Trump, the worst thing he ever did was make the narrative about China. Like Tucker Carlson, who now people say, oh, Tucker's so great and stuff. Tucker was horrible on China, and he still is pretty bad. But he was one of the first people to be horrible about China, and Trump was the same way. They mainstreamed being bad about China. Used to just be kind of a fringe thing. Now it's very mainstream, and it's because of them. But just going back, 2010, 2011, 2012, when the crisis hit, the global financial crisis, which I super don't have time to go into all that stuff, but the global financial crisis hits, China is holding tons of U.S. debt, right? The Russians, and this comes from, what's his name? I want to say Gensler, but it's not Gensler. Geithner. Geithner puts this out in his book. He says, look, the Russians actually went to the Chinese and were like, hey, we should dump. You should dump your treasury holdings right now and really stick it to the Americans and see if we can break the dollar system. And the Chinese were like, nah, we're good. We're good. So it's clear the Chinese at that point were not looking to jump on us, right? They understood that, who's feeding who here is a mutually beneficial arrangement. There started to be clashes, though, in the South China Sea. And this is in the news today. It's still a thing in the news today. There are these tiny little spits of sand. shoals, right? Second Thomas Shoal, the Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines claims these little specks of sand, right? The Spratlys, these are another one. Okay. These are only a few hundred miles from China, right? They're thousands of miles away from us, have nothing to do with our security at all. The Chinese started to build these up to put, for example, like try and put a runway in on one of them, right? Similar to what we did on Guam way back, 50, 60 years ago. This, however, set off a firestorm in Washington because the Philippines objected. The Philippines had beached a boat. It's called the Sierra Madre. You can look at pictures of it online. I actually wrote an article. If you type in Joseph Solis-Mullen Libertarian Institute, you can find all my articles. Just scroll back a couple pages and you'll find several articles where I go into the whole dispute over these shoals, because this was really the crux of the matter, because this was when Washington's thinking really changed. It was understood that we have this mutually beneficial thing going on economically, but security prerogative wise, Obama, the U.S. president, the king of the world, came over and said, all right, everybody, we're both going to back off. Okay. And we're going to talk about this. And the Philippines did, and the Chinese didn't. And this ruffled everyone in Washington the wrong way. And this was the beginning of it. This is when you start seeing speeches. This is when you start seeing it show up in national security planning documents. Again, there had been only hints of it. There had just been little sprinklings of it. Very early George W. Bush years concerns prior to getting distracted by the war on terror, which was a huge failure and debacle. And you had, what was his name? He was a Clinton guy. Of course, he was a Clinton guy. The Obama team is full of Clinton guys, and the Biden team is the Obama team. Yeah. So it all just makes sense.
It's all Clinton guys.
It's why the policies never change. It's all the same people, all the way from George H.W. Bush, from Clinton, all the way through. That's why the policies don't change. It's really fantastic. It's really crazy to look at. Sorry, just as an aside, like it's totally crazy. And if anyone is wondering, like, what about government? Like, why are you a libertarian? In what other job could you fail this much and be this bad and just keep getting hired? There's no accountability at all. This is why the idea of public property and public sector, like this is why it's bad, because there's no metric, there's no accountability, there's nothing about that. There's nothing about that.
We're not holding them accountable. They're not holding themselves accountable, and they just get to keep failing over and
diffuse costs, concentrated benefits, but these diffuse costs add up and up and up and up and up until we're looking at $2 trillion deficits annually. I couldn't believe it when the Congressional Budget Office released that. I couldn't even believe it, and it was like, wow, $2 trillion every year for the next 10 years, like without question. If nothing changes at all, that's what it'll be. It could get worse. In fact, it's the government, so it's certainly going to get worse. I don't make a lot of like hardcore predictions. It'll be worse. We will hit that $50 trillion mark 2030, no problem. 2032, no problem. Used to be we didn't have to worry about that till the 2050s or something like that, but we're getting there. We're going to get there in record time.
Quickly.
Actually, that's the new book that I'm working on, is like explaining to people the national debt, how it works, treasury auctions, all that stuff. It's going to be short too, so it's going to be very readable. But getting back to China, I can't remember the guy's name. Anyway, he had given this speech. You can find it, where he talks about China being a free rider, that China needs to embrace its role in upholding the rules-based international order. And are they going to do that or not? And of course, what is the rules-based order? Right. And what is the rules-based order? It's you play by America's rules. Who are the bad guys? The people who don't do whatever the United States wants when it comes to security prerogatives. We can have economic disagreements all day long. We can go to the WTO. We can have all these talking shops. Washington will sell out its working class if you'll eventually give in, right? It's why all these asymmetrical trade concessions happened in the first place. It was never free trade. It was asymmetrical trade concessions in exchange for military bases, right? That's what it was. And Washington has always had that deal on the table. And they thought that's the deal that they were cultivating with the Chinese. And that's why the whole dispute in the South China Sea there. And of course, there's a lot of natural resource wealth there, right? And whose companies are going to get in there and get a little taste of that? Is it going to be Chinese companies, or is it going to be American companies partnering with their domestic Philippine partners and things of that nature, right? This is the stuff that's being fought over here. This is why it's happening. Not to help us. Not to help us. We got plenty of oil, natural gas, food, you name it. We might want to buy some rare earths materials from China, but we could always buy them somewhere else. But China would love to buy them from us. This is the other thing about, what if China controlled Taiwan? What are they going to do with all these microchips? Eat them? Throw them away? They need to sell them, you idiots.
Yeah.
What do you think? But of course,
that's one thing I wanted to ask about as well, is we seem to be the largest importer, correct? I mean, at least one of them. I mean, that might fluctuate from year to year, but who's going to purchase all of their Chinese-made goods?
Us. When you look at this is one of the reasons that I think the whole conflict with Russia needed to be escalated the way it was to make a demonstration to the Chinese. I don't think that Washington thought that it was going to go this way at all, but of course, isn't that what you could say about all of Washington's plans?
Yeah.
But I think it was to make a demonstration to the Chinese, to show them that, look, if you mess around with us, look what we can get all these other countries to do. And people say, oh, well, the global South didn't go along with that. The global South doesn't matter, because all of China's exports that its economy is totally dependent on go to all the countries that agreed to sanction China, or that agreed to sanction Russia. And I think it was one of those flex moves, because before that all happened, what was Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan running around doing? Making sure that they could get the sanctions package they wanted in place. It wasn't about diffusing the situation. It was making sure that they had stone cold, ironclad agreement that this is what we're doing. And again, I pulled up the map afterward and looked. I mean, this is where China's exports go. They go to Western Europe. They go to North America. They go to Australia. They go to Canada. And these are the countries. And if those got shut down, which of course there's always going to be trade evasion, right? There's always going to be sanctions evasion. You know, I love when the economist starts crying about, you know, exports to Moldova are through the roof from Germany. This is suspicious. It's like, well, duh. Right. Yeah. Of course, this is exactly what you expect to happen.
Yeah.
So if sanctions don't work, I mean, it's been this slow process of coming to doubt Washington's policies, and it's great for me to see this coming to the mainstream. It's not reflected yet in government policy. There's still just that neocon internationalist, it's a very specific type of internationalist that's militarist, a militarist internationalist, getting together, that horrible center of Democrats and Republicans who just want to do the same thing over and over. On the wings, you can see it starting to get questioned. On the bookshelves, you can see major academics questioning that, like the Georgetown government service school, like 2 of their professors wrote a pretty critical book, and Princeton University Press published it. A staff writer at The Economist, which, like, The Economist is, like, you know, a flagship publication of the UK establishment. Like, one of their staff writers wrote a book called Backfire: How Sanctions Don't Work. So and the population, the voting population, one of the things that Trump said that really resonated with people was this idea that common Americans are getting screwed by all of this overseas adventurism. You know, the corporate press was horrified that him
just
condemning McCain and Powell. Yeah, people understand.
Yeah.
So it's frustrating to see how slow it is, but it is happening. It's just a question of whether or not we can move this needle far enough. And the China thing is really tough, because China looks big on the map, and aren't they a bunch of communists? And I heard, opioids, and they stole all the jobs and are buying all the farmland. And it's just this narrative that's constantly beating people over the head. And it's so hard to get those facts through to them, because they've already been primed to believe something completely different.
Yeah.
And so it's tough. It's tough because this China threat, like, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
China's not going anywhere. The regime is going to have a lot of difficulties, and it's of course it's possible that they could stumble, and this is a very tight window that they're going through here over the next 10 to 15 years. And some of the neocons actually recognize that, and that's why they believe now's the time to push on their throat and see if we can't get them to react now, which is just so stupid. But,
so would you feel comfortable saying, because to me, looking at all of this, it really does seem like all propaganda. Because when you look at the reality of China, and I mean, this is something, unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it, at least this time. I would definitely like to have you back. But I mean, China is still recovering from the Great Leap Forward. They never really fully recovered from any of this. And then you've got the results of their one-child policy, which Jay Forte brought up in the comment section. I mean, there's all these things that has put China in a much worse position than people, I think, actually realize, especially over here, because we're just pumped full of CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, you name it. You name the propaganda, and we're pumped full of it. So it does seem as though all of this is just propaganda.
Well, one thing that definitely stands out to me with you saying that is bringing up, the Great Leap Forward and things of that nature. Like, our government has at various times made deals to live with Mao, with Stalin. You're telling me that we can't come to an understanding with Xi Jinping, who's basically just a state capitalist, with Vladimir Putin, who is basically indistinguishable from like a, conservative Christian Republican here in the United States? Like, are you kidding me? This is who we can't get along with? That's an indictment of our leadership.
Yeah.
That's an indictment of our leadership, plain and simple. And the problem really is that there's so many interests that are being fed by, I mean, think about it. Like, our military budget is $1 trillion a year now. $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. $1 trillion is a lot of money. And that's not even calculating in all the additional costs and the other people getting paid as a result of these policies. Like, it's a big jobs program, and everyone's getting a cut. And so the idea of China, there needs to be a reason. There has to be a reason to keep these things going. I mean, I don't actually think there needs to be a reason to keep these things going.
Yeah.
I think we'd all be richer and much better off without these policies.
Yeah.
But it's a different question. I mean, those are not even questions that get asked. You don't get to be in the position that the decision makers are in now without already believing that all of these things are vital. Like, there may be one or two of them who are just very straight up cynically Douglas Feith style evil master manipulator types, Dick Cheney's of the world. But no, if you look at someone like Mike McFaul, who is the ambassador to Russia, and he's at Stanford now, and he does all sorts of terrible stuff, that guy's a true freaking believer. That guy 100% believes the things he says. And that's terrifying because they're so wrong. They're so wrong. But he 100% believes them and would be willing to, I don't know, maybe see you taken off the internet, locked up, if it really came down to it. I mean, he believes his stuff that passionately, and there's no one more dangerous than someone who absolutely believes that they're right and that the collective good is at stake if they don't do A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z. That's how you get a bunch of Japanese locked up in internment camps. It's how you get peace activists thrown in prison for 20 years. I mean, we've lived through this stuff, and we can live through it again. There is no, there's nothing magical protecting us. The Constitution is as effective as we are willing to make it. And that's pretty scary.
Especially these days.
I don't have a lot of faith in my fellow Americans in that respect. They just don't seem to realize that if emergency creates a state of exception that suspends the constitutional order, the state will always seek emergencies in order to exercise exceptional authority. Like, there can't be an exception. It's just the rules. You can't suspend the Constitution in the name of emergency, or there will always be another emergency. And it's just that simple.
It seems like we've been in a constant state of emergency since 9/11. So
yeah.
So
absolutely.
Well, on that, I'll get you out of here. I know you had a hard time out, and I know you still got a long night ahead of you. So let's go ahead and let everyone know where they can find you.
Well, I'm a political scientist and economist at the Libertarian Institute. I'm also a history professor. I post the lectures. I made a YouTube channel so that students could have lecture access if they were away that day. I'm on Twitter. that was my name, at Solis_Mullen. Is my Twitter handle. I'm sorry, I just got social media. We were talking at the start of this. I do not love social media. I started one when I started at the Institute. It's my first one. I started an Instagram. I'm not even sure what my name is on Instagram, but I do put content on there. I do put content on there for people. The book is The Fake China Threat, and it's Very Real Danger. Available at the Libertarian Institute. Keep a lookout for future projects. Like I said, have one on the national debt and you. What is it? How does it work? What are the consequences and possible futures? And that's it.
Hey, I'll make sure all of that is in the episode description after the episode. I'll make sure and gather all that up so people can easily find you. And other than that, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in to another episode of Rise to Liberty. I would really like to extend a thank you for showing up and discussing what I view as a really important topic, especially these days. Any topic that is usually used to sell war, I view as incredibly important, especially in this day where it seems like so many people are so bloodthirsty and unforgiving for so many things. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. I'd definitely like to get you back, and if you hang out for just a sec, we'll get the stream wrapped up. And for everyone else, make sure to go to risetoliberty.com/links, which is where you can find everything. Or switch over here real quick, you can just go ahead and scan that little QR code right there, and that will pull everything up. It will find every platform. We've got some awesome stuff coming up. Actually, I'll just leave that up for a sec. We've got some awesome stuff coming up. We've got some deep dives into MK Ultra coming. My personal opinion, MK Ultra never ended. Things just got subcontracted and moved around, renamed, and there's plenty of other people that were directly affected by it that believe the same thing. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be going into that, and otherwise, until next time, stay free, my friends.